The air was thick with tension. It was an unforgiving day in 1945, just days after the end of the war in Europe. Far from the battlefields of Europe, across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the American forces were finalizing their plans for the imminent conclusion of the war against Japan. The air was pregnant with anticipation, and the world was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the terrible conflict would end. The war had already stretched its toll on humanity, with millions lost to both the brutality of battle and the horrors of internment camps. In these camps, among those caught in the conflict's swirling storm, were the Japanese women who had been detained by the Allies, unaware of the changes that would soon shatter their understanding of the world they had been raised to believe in. The women, captured by the Allied forces in the final stages of the war, were about to be confronted with something that would shift their perception of reality forever. The year 1945, when the Pacific conflict reached its climax, marked a pivotal moment not only for the soldiers who fought, but for those who were indirectly involved, those who had spent years in a brutal, chaotic environment, with no idea of the world beyond the walls of their captivity. The internment camps held women who had been rounded up for various reasons. Some were families of soldiers, others were suspected of espionage, or simply caught in the general madness of wartime paranoia. Now these women were facing an unknown future, confined by the war but at the mercy of the forces of liberation. One fateful day, as the war was drawing to a close, the Allied forces decided to show these women photographs of Hollywood stars, faces that had long been a part of their subconscious, characters they had heard of, but only in the confines of propaganda. The women, whose knowledge of the outside world had been severely limited by years of war and internment, were exposed to a new, startling reality, a world beyond the confines of their war-torn island, a world they had only seen in whispers or in the eyes of the propaganda machine. What they saw next would shock them into silence. The contrast between the harsh reality they had endured and the glamour of Hollywood could not have been starker. Their world was one of bloodshed, loss, and fear, while these photographs depicted a world that was filled with beauty, power, and privilege, a world that had existed beyond the war, a world that felt almost alien to them. These women, many of whom had spent years isolated from the rest of the world, were confronted with the vast disparity between their lives and the lives of the stars. The images seemed to carry an almost surreal quality, as if they were peering into a dream they would never be able to reach. The photographs showed them the faces of women, bold, confident, and unscarred by the horrors they had known. Their faces were lit with an aura of grace, a stark contrast to the deep marks left on the women of Japan by the war. For the first time, they were faced with a world that was different from the one they had known. And in that moment, as the camera zoomed in on the expressions of these prisoners, something shifted in their eyes. The realization that there was a world outside of their suffering, one filled with the power of cinema and fame, hit them with an overwhelming force. It was a shocking awakening, one that would be etched in their memories forever. The photographs were more than just images. They were windows to another world, one that was full of possibilities and dreams. In the minds of these women, the faces they saw on the glossy pages of magazines and the black and white stills seemed distant, yet they carried with them a weight that went beyond mere celebrity. These images represented freedom, success, and a lifestyle that felt worlds apart from the lives they had been forced to endure. What was once a dream, relegated to the farthest corners of their imagination, was suddenly very much real. As the pictures were passed around, the women exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and disbelief. Some looked at the images with wide eyes, taking in the beauty, while others seemed lost in thought, their minds grappling with the implications of what they were seeing. The conflict between the image of Hollywood glamour and the grimness of their own lives was overwhelming. Their world had been one of deprivation, suffering, and fear, and now they were staring into the eyes of a world that seemed to promise everything they had been denied. In this pivotal moment, the women were not just witnessing photographs, they were being exposed to a different kind of war. The psychological warfare of images and ideals that would shape their understanding of who they were and what the world was capable of. For many, it was a moment that would remain with them forever. But as the days passed and the war officially ended, these women were left to ponder the significance of what they had seen. They were no longer just prisoners of war. They had been presented with an entirely new lens through which to view the world, a world they could never have imagined, but one that would come to define their future. This moment, seemingly inconsequential in the grand scope of history, was a turning point for many of these women. It represented the gap between what they had known and what they had yet to discover. It was the beginning of their awakening, one that would eventually lead them to realize the full extent of their captivity, not just in terms of physical confinement, but in terms of their place in a world far larger and more complex than they had ever imagined. The dawn of the 1940s brought with it a world ravaged by war, a war that, despite its catastrophic toll on humanity, would reshape the global landscape forever. As the conflict unfolded, the stakes could not have been higher. Nations scrambled to assert their power, and the world's fate seemed to hang in the balance. In the East, Japan had built a formidable empire, stretching from the islands of the Japanese archipelago across vast stretches of the Pacific and into China. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies were engaged in a brutal, all-encompassing struggle against the Axis powers, one that would ultimately shape the destiny of the modern world. By 1945, the war in Europe had ended, and the Allies had turned their full attention to Japan. The Pacific theater was a brutal, unforgiving environment, where combat often took place on remote islands with harsh, unforgiving terrain. The United States, having suffered greatly during the earlier years of the war, was now in the position of ultimate power. The Pacific Campaign was marked by fierce battles, bloody island-hopping campaigns, and the gradual destruction of Japan's military infrastructure. But as the war dragged on, the question of how to bring the conflict to a decisive close remained. The need to break the Japanese resolve became urgent. In a bold and controversial move, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender in August 1945. Yet, the human cost of the war extended far beyond the battlefield. As the Allies closed in on Japan, they began to capture key islands, and along with them, the prisoners of war, men and women who had been caught in the wake of this global storm. Among them were the Japanese women who had been taken as prisoners by the Allies. Their lives, though seemingly insignificant in the grand scope of the conflict, had been irrevocably altered by the brutal forces at play. They were a symbol of the suffering endured by civilians caught in the crossfire of war, people who had been forced to live through years of conflict, often with no understanding of why they were fighting or what they were fighting for. In many ways, these women represented the victims of a war waged far beyond their control. They were the wives, daughters, and mothers of soldiers who had been conscripted to fight. Some were taken as prisoners after the fall of key Japanese-held territories, while others had been displaced from their homes as a result of the American-led invasions. For these women, the war had been a distant and terrifying specter. They had been raised in a society where loyalty to the emperor and to the nation was paramount. Their lives had been shaped by the ideology of the state, which had sought to create a strong, united Japan, impervious to external threats. In this war-torn world, the women were not just victims of military strategy or tactics, but also of the propaganda machine that had painted a very different picture of the world. The Japanese government had long touted an idealized image of Japan, one in which its people were resilient, virtuous, and superior. However, when confronted with the brutal reality of war, many of these women began to see the disparity between the ideals they had been raised with and the reality they now faced. This conflict between the idealized version of Japan and the harsh truths of the war was something they would have to confront in the coming years. For the Japanese forces, the war in the Pacific had become a desperate struggle for survival. The Japanese military, though initially victorious in the early years of the war, found itself increasingly overwhelmed by the might of the United States. The Allies, equipped with superior technology, strategy, and resources, began to turn the tide. The Japanese, however, had a deep sense of honor and loyalty to their emperor, which led them to fight relentlessly, even in the face of certain defeat. They believed that surrender was dishonorable, and as a result they fought to the bitter end, with devastating consequences for both sides. The nature of the war was changing as the Japanese leadership scrambled to find a way to halt the relentless advance of the American forces. On the ground, soldiers fought tenaciously, while in the skies, American bombers targeted strategic locations with increasing frequency. The Allied forces had gained the upper hand, but the Japanese leadership continued to resist, hoping for a shift in the global balance of power. In Japan, the military leadership's focus on maintaining honor and pride had become a stumbling block, and it was now clear that the war was no longer winnable. In the midst of this, the women who had been taken as prisoners were unaware of the looming shifts in power and the impending consequences of the war. They had no understanding of the decisions being made in the war rooms of Tokyo, or the calculations that had led to the devastating American attacks. Their lives had been shaped by the same propaganda that had driven Japan to war, and as prisoners, they were left to grapple with the aftermath of a world they could not control. As the war in the Pacific reached its bloody climax, these women were caught between two worlds. They were prisoners in a system that had promised them safety and security, yet had delivered only chaos and fear. And now, as the war's final moments approached, they were faced with an unimaginable truth: that the world they had known and the values they had been raised with were slipping away, replaced by something that was foreign, strange, and ultimately far more powerful than anything they had ever imagined. The pictures of Hollywood stars, in many ways, represented the final blow to their idealized view of the world. These women had been raised on a steady diet of nationalism, sacrifice, and loyalty. They had been taught to admire the image of their emperor, to respect the warriors who fought for Japan, and to view the world through the lens of the Japanese state. But now, faced with the glamour of Hollywood, they were forced to confront the truth that their lives, their struggles, and their suffering had been part of a much larger global conflict, one that they had no control over. It was in that brief and disorienting moment, when the women of the Japanese prisoner camps were handed the glossy photographs of Hollywood stars, that the true gravity of their situation began to sink in. The image was more than a passing curiosity or a fleeting glimpse of a foreign world. It was a symbol of the vast gulf that had formed between the world they knew and the world outside. These photographs, carefully chosen to represent the glamour and sophistication of Western culture, represented a harsh truth, one they had been isolated from during the war, and one they had never truly anticipated confronting. To the women who had lived through the endless turmoil of the Pacific conflict, the contrast was staggering. These were the same women who had heard rumors of the West but had never seen it firsthand. Raised in an environment steeped in militaristic fervor, honor, and a rigid societal structure, the women of Japan had been isolated in many ways, not just geographically but ideologically as well. Their world had been dictated by the imperial vision of their leaders, a vision that set Japan apart from the rest of the world, defining it as a unique, superior force in global politics. They had been led to believe in the exceptionalism of their culture, in the moral purity of their cause, and in the infallibility of their leaders. Yet as the war progressed, cracks began to appear in this carefully constructed narrative. Now they were being forced to face a truth they could no longer deny. The American forces, whose military presence had grown steadily across the Pacific, had not only won battles but had also begun the process of deconstructing the very ideology that had fueled Japan's aggression. The women were now part of a much larger experiment in re-education, a process that sought to transform the minds of the people who had fought so fiercely for their country's ideals. But this was not just about changing their political views. It was about shattering their perception of the world itself. Hollywood, with its stars and stories of glamour and success, stood as an emblem of everything their wartime propaganda had denounced: a world of materialism, individualism, and above all, a world outside their control. As the photographs were passed from hand to hand, a heavy silence fell over the room. Some of the women stared in awe, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. These were women of grace and elegance, their every feature a symbol of wealth, power, and freedom. The world they inhabited, one of poverty, loss, and struggle, could not have been more different. The soldiers and civilians who had fought on both sides of the Pacific were far removed from these images, and yet they were confronted by them in a way that made the distance between their lives and the lives of Hollywood's elite seem insurmountable. For many of the women in the camps, the experience was a profound reckoning. They had been raised to admire the strength and resilience of their own people, to believe in the ideals of the Japanese nation, and to hold deep respect for their emperor and his soldiers. They had been told that they were part of a divine mission, a mission that sought to elevate Japan to a position of dominance in the world. But now as they gazed upon the faces of these stars, they were forced to confront the limitations of that worldview. They realized that the ideals they had been raised on were no match for the immense power and allure of Western culture, which they had long regarded as an enemy. The immediate shock of the photographs was followed by a quiet contemplation, a deep, unsettling silence as each woman processed the moment in her own way. Some felt anger, others confusion, and still others a deep sadness, but there was no denying the emotional impact of what they had seen. In that instant, they were confronted not only with the realities of war, but with the realization that their lives had been shaped by forces far beyond their control. They had been part of a larger machine, a machine that had been crumbling under the weight of its own ambition, and now, with the war coming to an end, they were being shown a world that was not only different from the one they had known, but one that had completely bypassed their struggles. The United States had won the war, and with that victory, it began to reshape the Pacific and the world in its own image. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been a brutal and decisive measure to force Japan's surrender, but the true implications of this action were still unfolding. Japan had been defeated, but in many ways its people were only just beginning to come to terms with the enormity of what had transpired. For the women in the camps, the realization that their country had lost the war was a bitter pill to swallow, but even more so was the realization that the world they had been taught to believe in was crumbling, and in the face of this collapse, Hollywood stars, their faces frozen in time, seemed like symbols of a world they could never touch. It was not just the women of Japan who were forced to confront these stark realities. American forces, too, were dealing with their own set of moral and psychological dilemmas. The war had left deep scars on everyone involved, and the process of occupying Japan and rebuilding it would be just as challenging as the battles that had preceded it. The women of the prisoner camps would eventually emerge from their captivity, but they would never be the same. The shock of seeing these images would stay with them, altering their understanding of the world and their place within it. They would have to reconcile the ideals they had been raised with against the overwhelming presence of the New World Order. As the Allies continued to cement their hold over Japan, they began the process of re-education, focusing on transforming the Japanese people into productive, peaceful citizens. The war had been a terrible chapter in world history, but it had also brought about sweeping changes in global power dynamics. The women, now freed from captivity, would have to adapt to this new world, a world in which they had little to no say, yet one in which they would be forced to live. The end of World War II did not mark a clean break between the old world and the new. For the women who had been interned, their lives would never return to the way they had been before. The photographs of Hollywood stars, shocking in their glamour and distance, had stirred something deep within them, a recognition that the world they had known was irrevocably gone. The war had not just reshaped the map of nations, but it had also altered the very fabric of their understanding of self and identity. What they saw was more than just a symbol of Western luxury. It was a manifestation of a changing world order, one that would soon sweep across Japan, dismantling the old empire and replacing it with a new set of ideals and values. In the years that followed the end of the war, Japan would undergo an intense period of occupation and transformation. The Allied forces, led primarily by the United States, set about the task of rebuilding Japan, not only its infrastructure and economy, but also its political and social systems. For the Japanese people, especially the women, this would be a time of profound personal and societal change. The rigid hierarchical structures of Japanese society that had defined the pre-war era were now being challenged by a new, foreign influence, one that preached democracy, individualism, and freedom of expression. The images of Hollywood stars, once shocking to the Japanese women, now became part of the larger narrative of post-war Japan's rebirth. In many ways, these photographs represented more than just a fleeting moment of shock. They embodied the cultural shift that was underway. The Japanese people, who had once been taught to reject the West, were now forced to interact with it on a daily basis. The entertainment industry, with its portrayal of freedom and glamour, stood in stark contrast to the wartime ideology that had dominated their lives. These images, once seen as symbols of decadence, would now be part of a new cultural exchange, one that would slowly, over time, reshaped the minds of a generation. For the women who had seen these photographs, the transition was not always easy. Many struggled with the emotional and psychological weight of the war, and the rapid cultural changes that followed. The war had left scars not just on their bodies, but on their minds and spirits. Yet the Hollywood images offered a strange form of solace. They were a glimpse into a world that represented something completely different from the trauma they had endured. In a sense, these images became a lifeline, a reminder that there was something beyond the ruins of war, a world of opportunity and possibility. But this was not just a story of individual transformation. It was a larger, collective reckoning for the nation. Japan's defeat in the war meant that its people were forced to confront the realities of their imperial ambitions and the rise of a new power that was committed to spreading its influence. For Japan's leaders, the surrender was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. Under the guidance of American forces, Japan would shift from a militaristic empire to a peaceful democratic nation. This shift would take decades to fully unfold, but the first steps were taken in those early years of occupation. The cultural exchange that began with the introduction of Hollywood stars to Japanese women in the internment camps would continue to shape the relationship between Japan and the West in the post-war years. The fascination with Western culture, and especially with the entertainment industry, became a defining feature of Japan's post-war identity. Japanese cinema, once heavily influenced by nationalist themes, began to incorporate elements of Western film styles. The fascination with Hollywood stars turned into a cultural obsession that extended beyond the realm of film, influencing fashion, music, and even everyday life. But the impact was not one-sided. As Japan opened up to the outside world, its own culture began to influence the West. The influence of Japanese art, literature, and film began to seep into American and European culture, marking the beginning of a new era of cultural exchange. The women who had once been shocked by the images of Hollywood stars now became part of a larger movement that transcended national boundaries. The war had created a rift between nations, but in the years that followed, this rift would slowly be bridged by a shared understanding of human experience, mediated through art, culture, and the common struggle for peace. As Japan rebuilt itself, the psychological impact of the war lingered. Many of the women who had been prisoners found themselves caught in a strange paradox. On one hand, they were free from the chains of captivity, but on the other, they were now tasked with navigating a world that had been forever altered. The ideals they had grown up with, the fierce loyalty to the emperor, the belief in Japan's superiority, were now in direct conflict with the new values they were being asked to embrace. This internal conflict, the clash between old loyalties and new freedoms, would shape their lives in ways they had never expected. The photographs of Hollywood stars had provided a glimpse into a world of beauty and luxury, but they also represented something deeper, a world that existed outside the war, outside the political struggles, outside the ideologies that had torn their lives apart. The war had shown them the cost of blind nationalism, and these images offered them an alternative. They were no longer just survivors of the war. They were witnesses to the birth of a new world, one that would be shaped not by the battles of the past, but by the possibilities of the future. In the years that followed, Japan would become one of the most powerful economies in the world. Its people would rebuild their society, recover from the devastation of the war, and ultimately rise to become a symbol of resilience and renewal. The women who had once been shocked by the photographs of Hollywood stars would become a part of this transformation. Their stories, like the stories of millions of others, would become the foundation of a new Japan, one that, for all its scars, would find hope and strength in the ashes of its past. The photographs of Hollywood stars, now faded with time, would forever remain symbols of a moment in history, when a world was turned upside down, and when the power of images, culture, and ideology converged in ways that none could have anticipated. The impact of those images on the women of Japan was just one small chapter in the larger story of the world's post-war recovery. But it was a chapter that carried with it lessons about the power of media, the role of culture in shaping identity, and the enduring human struggle to reconcile the past with the present.